Welcome, welcome everyone. Those of you who are joining, I see the list of people joining quickly. We will take probably a couple of minutes before everyone joins. My name is Francesco Di Lillo, and I'm the director of the European Union Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'm honored to be together with a group of distinguished academics who have gladly and enthusiastically joined all together to support this initiative. Dr. Pasquale Anichino will moderate this session. But before we go into the actual substance of this opening webinar, I would like to share with you some housekeeping items in terms of technical aspects of using Zoom. You will see on the bottom of your screen that you have three buttons. One is a raise hand, another one is a Q&A button, and the other one is a chat. The chat is disabled, but we will use it to share with you some information that may be useful for you to follow up after this meeting. The Q&A is where you can actually interact with the speakers, with us. So as we go and proceed through the presentations, feel free to start typing your questions, and we will make sure that we will address as many as we can. And finally, through the polls, we will have a couple of questions that we want your feedback and input with, and we look forward to engage with you. So without further ado, we are excited to be all here, and I'll pass the floor to Dr. Anichino.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Thank you very much to all the co-hosts, and thank you very much to the participants. I'm very glad that even with the time and situational constraints that we have been able to organize this webinar series, which really started with an idea that Francesco had, and then we jumped on it, and then the different institutions that you see as a co-host immediately subscribed to the kind of mission we had in mind. So I thank all of them for that. And my role here is, first of all, I have to bring to all of you the greetings of Professor Moalem from FGV Law School in Rio de Janeiro. He couldn't be with us today because, of course, of what is going on also in Brazil. And in Brazil now the situation is quite difficult. So this week he will not be able to join us, but he will be with us in the next webinars. And then why are we here, and why are we here for this webinar? For two reasons, I think. The first reason is that in every crisis, I think there is also an opportunity, as we often say. And I mean, as a kind of epistemic academic community, we are by nature a global community, and often we don't have a lot of possibility to interact with colleagues from all over the world unless we travel to conferences and other parts. So this crisis is offering us the opportunity to explore and innovate in ways to cooperate and collaborate at global level, and we wanted to experiment that. And then on the other side, there is also the fact that we felt that there was a demand for people involved in government or scholars working in law and religion to discuss the impact that the current COVID crisis is having on religious groups, how religious groups are coping with that, what are going to be the constitutional effects on the protection of religious freedom of the COVID crisis. And you know, probably you are all familiar that reflections are going out now, are going to be published. Our colleague at the US Commission on International Religious Freedom have published a very relevant fact sheet a couple of days ago, which I actually invite you, all of you, to have a look at that. Other academic colleagues are going on with the publishing initiative. I have in mind here, for instance, the Diresom initiative in Italy, or the Berkeley Center, what they are doing. So there is already a kind of a catalysis movement where a lot of sources and collection is going on. So this was a way to innovate in another space to foster real interaction among people, and this is why we have planned this series. What I need to give you, it's a kind of roadmap of what we are going to do. Our idea was not to have a single event, but to have a series of events. and all the co-sponsoring institutions agree to this. So BYU Law School, FBK, FJV, Cambridge Center for Religion and International Studies, the LDS Church European Union office in Brussels. So we will move with that. We have a landing page of the different events. You should all be familiar with that. And on that landing page, you can already find information on the next 4 webinar series until the end of April. So next week, same time, same day, we are going to have Jan Fiegel, which was the former EU Special Envoy for the promotion and protection of freedom of religion outside of the European Union, which is going to talk about FoRB, COVID-19, and human dignity. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to have a panel on civil society organization perspective, and then we're planning on a panel on EU institutions perspective. Our idea is to have a global perspective on this. So we will have different regional focus. So we will discuss South America, we will discuss Africa, we will discuss Asia, we will discuss North America. And a lot of colleagues from all over the world are willing to contribute with that. So on the landing page that we will constantly update, you will find all the relevant information to join the different meetings, and we look very much forward to all the meetings that we are going to have in the next few weeks now, because we don't know when the different lockdowns are gonna end in every country. So this is gonna shift country by country, but we plan basically until the summer. So we have had a medium-term planning on this because we really want to have something solid and structured. And you, of course, are part of that initiative. So we are going to proceed with a short kickoff intervention from all the co-hosts, about 6-7 minutes each, and then you can jump in, intervene, raise your question, and Francesco is going to also to launch some poll in the meantime. So we will speak in alphabetical order, and the first co-host to speak is Judd Birdsall from the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies. Judd, I give you the floor, and I see that Francesco has already launched a poll, and I invite all of you to answer to the poll that Francesco has launched. In the meantime, Judd, you have the floor.
Okay. Well, thank you, Pasquale, for chairing this session. Thanks to all the panelists for your contributions and the willingness of your institutions to co-host, co-sponsor this series of discussions. A special thanks to Francesco and his team in Brussels for arranging these Zoom calls over the next several weeks. I'm really looking forward to this series of conversations. As Pasquale mentioned, there are now already several initiatives that are looking at religion and the coronavirus pandemic from a variety of angles. And I think the conversation we're launching today complements those other initiatives and adds value in the way that we will be bringing together both government officials and non-governmental leaders and thinkers to discuss how the pandemic is shaping religion and shaping conditions for freedom of religion or belief in a number of different regions around the world. What I thought I would do in my few minutes today is offer just a couple of introductory reflections on how this current pandemic may shape levels of religiosity around the world. If we think about the role that religion plays in individual lives, in the life of our societies, it's clear that there are massive implications that this pandemic has for religion, and the ways in which religious communities respond have massive implications for even the very spread of this virus. So we can think of religion as one of the primary ways that human beings form communities, form collective identities, shape and enforce norms and values, a primary way in which we make sense of the world and cope with life's challenges. Religion is often associated with a particular place or sacred space. And so it's clear that COVID-19 upends our normal religious life in all sorts of ways. Now, in the face of disasters, both man-made and natural, we tend to see upticks in religiosity as religious people more intensely look to their religious communities for comfort. and look for reassurance in their religious practices, rituals, and beliefs. And we saw this even in very secular places like New York City and Paris after 9/11 and the Notre Dame Cathedral fire, when churches were full for weeks or even months afterwards. But what happens when the churches and mosques and synagogues and temples and shrines are all closed? When clergy can't meet with their parishioners, their faithful, in anything like a normal way. And as religious groups increasingly now move to virtual, online formats, what impact will that have in the short and longer term on levels of religiosity? Truth is, I don't know. I don't know if anybody really knows what the impact will be, which underscores that we're in quite a unique situation with COVID-19. Late last year, right before the coronavirus pandemic hit, a professor at the University of Copenhagen published a paper looking at the concept of religious coping and how you tend to have heightened religiosity after unpredictable disasters, particularly earthquakes. And this heightened, intensified religiosity can go on for years and even be passed on to future generations. But with COVID-19, we are in a sense facing a predictable disaster. We can see it coming. We can track the rates of infections and deaths. There are steps that we can take individually and collectively to mitigate its spread. So in the face of a sort of predictable disaster, we might ask cheekily, you know, are religious people going to be more focused on folding their hands in prayer or washing their hands for the recommended 20 seconds? My sense is we'll probably see a lot of both. The Archbishop of Canterbury has recommended that Christians recite the Lord's Prayer while washing their hands. I've done this. It takes about 22 or 23 seconds, depending on your speed of recitation. Whether you say sins or trespasses will increase the duration of your hand washing. But that guidance from an archbishop about washing hands and praying, I think is a really interesting example of both turning to faith, but also following scientifically grounded medical advice. And again, underscores that we are in a unique situation with COVID-19. Compared to, say, the plagues of medieval Europe, where for lack of really any real knowledge of how a plague was spread, people turned to religious explanations, theological explanations. We know a lot about the coronavirus. There are still things we don't know, but we know we've mapped its genome. Scientists have studied how long it can stay active on surfaces. Vaccines are now underway, even though they'll likely take months and months to develop. Every morning we check our smartphones for the latest numbers of deaths and infections, the latest projections from epidemiologists. Here in England and around Europe, and I imagine around the world, people are opening their doors or their windows at certain times of the day or the week to applaud frontline medical staff. So for a great number of people, the coronavirus is a natural problem with a scientific solution, and medical staff are heroes. And that's not to suggest that science and faith are somehow incompatible. I happen to think they're highly complementary. And it's not to suggest that people won't turn to faith during this pandemic. But the coronavirus may look different than previous pandemics and other kinds of disasters in the impact that it could have on religious practice and on levels of religiosity. Well, there's a lot more that could be said about the impact of the pandemic on religion. The other panelists will take up some other themes. I very much look forward to your comments and questions today and to carrying on this conversation in the weeks ahead. Thank you. Pasquale, back to you.
Thank you very much, Jad. Sorry that I pushed you towards the conclusion of your intervention, but we want to be on time, and you were actually on time, so thank you very much. And actually the question that you raise, the best answer we can get is from somebody who is involved with a religious organization And this is why we have Francesco speaking after you. So Francesco from the European Union of Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Francesco, you have the floor for your 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Pasquale. It's amazing to see how many people have been joining so far, and also the distribution. You should be able to see the responses that you gave. Most of the people are from Europe, but pretty much we're covering every continent here. And it's also fascinating to see the distribution of the background of each of you. So it's really an honor to be with all of you today. And I would like to start by thanking again the sponsoring partners for joining efforts in this ambition webinar series. Likewise, on behalf of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I would like to thank you all for joining us from all over the world. Although we cannot see you face to face, it's a pleasure to know that we are all connected right now in this moment. When we planned this series, we knew that there would be interest, but you all stand as witness that a dialogue on COVID-19, religion and belief not only is important, but is also in high demand. I hope we will continue this path together throughout the series. In my role as Director of the European Union Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I will offer a more practical view on how the Church and its members have responded to this pandemic. I've also tried to address some of the questions that were submitted through the registration form. Let me begin by saying that our leaders, from Russell M. Nelson, Worldwide President of the Church, all the way down to regional and local levels, have been praying for world relief and collective safety. 2 weeks ago, the presidency of the Europe area of the Church shared a message to Europe's leaders, citizens, and people of goodwill. They shared sympathy for those affected and an invitation to society to look for opportunities to do good. And just last Sunday, President Nelson, whom we revere as a prophet, just called people of all faiths and beliefs to join a global fast for COVID-19 relief on Good Friday, that the present pandemic may be controlled, caregivers protected, the economy strengthened, and life normalized, quoting his words. Now, since prayers must be followed by actions, let me share a few examples of how the Church has been responding to the pandemic and how it has turned challenges into opportunities to benefit everyone. Looking at humanitarian aid, as concerns regarding the contagion continue to rise at the end of January, the Church began sending medical supplies and protective equipments to affected countries. That initial donations developed into a global effort, currently encompassing 39 countries across the globe, with new projects currently being evaluated, and in conjunction with many of our global partners. Aid has been provided by Latter-day Saint Charities, the humanitarian arm of the Church, but we cannot thank enough governments, international NGOs, and the host of people around the world working with us in contributing to solutions. Now, as a church, of course, we have Sunday meetings, conference, and other gatherings. And as of March 11, all public gatherings of the church and church members have been temporarily suspended worldwide until further notice. Similar measures had been in place earlier than that in selected areas. However, the suspension applies to all Sunday services and temple worship. This has led church leaders and members to turn to technology and home-centered gospel study. It's important to note that we have, as a church, a strong sense of community, and it's very important to us. So friendly meetings and pastoral visits have been replaced by phone calls, emails, video chats, and an intensive use of technology. Following established governmental guidelines, members reach out to each other, especially those who are unable to take care of themselves. You may be wondering about missionary work. Many of you know that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a missionary, volunteer, and service-driven faith. Some may have already met young men or women wearing a curious black name tag, approaching you on the street, asking to share their message. As a result of the pandemic, missionaries throughout the world, except those serving in the Europe and Europe East areas, are returning to their home countries, where they're asked to self-isolate for 14 days upon their arrival. They are given the option to end their service earlier or resume it when it will be safe. Many are continuing their service online using social media and video conferencing services. Another example of how the church was able to turn challenges into opportunities in this specific field is how we work with several governments to repatriate hundreds of their citizens, offering the extra seats on our chartered flights. This has been seen and valued as a relief, not only by the families of those who were able to benefit from those flights, but also from those governments with whom we worked and with whom we have built good relationships over the years. Church workforce. Finally, starting on March 16, Church has implemented a number of policies that apply to its global workforce, those of us basically who help with the administrative affairs of the Church, such as travel restrictions, social distancing, including working from home, and self-isolation practices. In turn, we're now rediscovering the beauty of shorter meetings and video conferencing. Let me conclude my remarks. This leads me to share some thoughts about the Church's experience. And let me ask this question on how should churches and religious leaders respond to the pandemic? This was asked during the registration form by some of you. Now, I don't want to share or say what other churches should do. This is based on our experience as a church. Let's continue to be humanitarian. In times like this, the world needs more individuals, religious leaders, and organizations who are willing to work together to reach out and care for those who can't do it on their own. Let's continue to follow and support the established health guidelines. Church leaders have a responsibility and the opportunity to help members of their faith to support and comply with health guidelines. Social distancing should not turn into social isolation. Members can look out for each other by means of technology. Mind and mental health is very important for all segments of society: men, women, children, the elderly, the sick, and the list goes on. And it's very important that we don't cut ties with other people, but we actually reach out. Continue to call upon the powers of heaven. From a theological point of view, as someone asked, we do not attach a specific message to this pandemic. But as President Nelson said, during times of deep distress, as when illness reaches pandemic proportion, the most natural thing for us to do is to call upon our Heavenly Father and His Son, the Master Healer, to show forth their marvelous power to bless the people of the earth. Close quote. So let me conclude now with the words of Elder Holland, one of our senior apostles from last week's General Conference. He said, and I quote, "When we have conquered this pandemic, and we will, may we be equally committed to freeing the world from this virus of hunger, freeing neighborhoods and nations from the virus of poverty, and for the gift of personal dignity for every child of God, unmarred by any form of racial, ethnic, and religious prejudice." If there is a message that I can share, this is the one that I would like to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for your intervention. It was very good to hear the internal perspective, if we want to call that way, from a religious organization, and we will hear more in this series of webinars from other religious perspectives as well. But it's a very important, this kind of message that you shared from your own internal perspective. I personally appreciated the stance that the LDS Church took since the beginning. Was one of the first church to basically close the building and follow health guidelines, and I really appreciate the effort that the church has done. Brett Scharf lives in Provo, or close to Provo, and he is the director of one of the really global and most important centers for the study of law and religion worldwide. So I'm sure that Professor Scharf will give us some material from reflection also from a legal point of view, which is also very welcome, because there are also a lot of people who are concerned on the impact that the pandemic will have on the protection of freedom of religion. Therefore, we look forward to hear from you, Brett. You have the floor.
Pasquale, thank you very much. Thank you to all of the co-organizers and panelists. As Pasquale said, I'm a scholar of law and religion, and I look at this field from an international law and a comparative law perspective. As I've been working from home over the last weeks, I've been thinking a lot about the current coronavirus pandemic as presenting a kind of stress test upon us and upon the institutions to which we belong. Think back to your high school days. I remember participating in a contest where we were trying to make a bridge out of nothing other than balsa wood and glue. And we were given some basic parameters, And then the bridges were subject to a stress test, basically measuring how much weight the bridge could bear before it broke under the strain. In other words, what was the, how many pounds of downward pressure could the bridge withstand? Or think in another context of heart health. When we take a stress test with respect to heart health, physicians measure how our heart works during physical exercise that becomes increasingly strenuous. So the question I've been asking myself is, how well are we as individuals and as members of institutions standing up to the challenges presented by the current coronavirus crisis? For some institutions, such as hospitals, ambulances, and EMTs, fire and police, we see quite a lot of discussion in the popular media. What I would like to do is I'd like to focus on the strength and resiliency of two particular institutions, specifically as it relates to our topic, freedom of religion and belief. The first is the state, and here I'm thinking of the government, and I'm also thinking of particular political leaders, although I'm not going to discuss political leaders. And I'm also thinking about religious communities, particular faith communities, and the leaders of those communities. For those of you who have tuned in, I have texted out through the chat room a question, and it is, if you were creating a stress test regarding freedom of religion and belief, what questions would you focus upon? I've been thinking about three basic benchmarks. Are we behaving in ways that are responsible, that are responsive, and that exhibit resilience? So let me talk a little bit first about the government. The baseline test here, I think, is equal treatment. Are governments engaging in discrimination, scapegoating, blaming, or harassing particular groups or minorities? A related question here is what counts as an essential service, since oftentimes there are differentiations about what types of activities are permitted and not permitted. A helpful question that I find in this context is thinking about how the government is treating religious groups in comparison to health clubs or gyms. Health clubs and gyms have sometimes been compared or analogized to the places of worship for the millennial generation, where they gather and build community and seek to improve themselves. But there are also places where we're in close proximity, where the transmission of disease is very possible. And it's interesting to compare the attitudes that governments have towards the regulation of a clearly secular activity, where we're in close proximity with each other, with a religious activity, where we're often in close proximity with each other. A second question that I've been asking myself is about the ability that our leaders have to set aside clearly partisan priorities at this time. Is this being treated as a national emergency, an international emergency, or as a political opportunity? It seems to me that this is a good time to set aside ordinary partisan political objectives. This isn't a good time to use the crisis as a way of building union membership or engaging in abortion politics. Let me say a word about religious groups. Here, I think the baseline test is whether religious groups are avoiding the twin hazards of meek compliance or truculent defiance. Those are terms used in an article I read in The Economist earlier this morning. Are religious groups being responsible? Here the baseline is, are you at least not being a part of the problem? Second, responsive. Are you a part of the solution? And resilient. How are you exhibiting strength under pressure? Now, there are many different dimensions of gathering, worship, pastoral care, counseling, attending to the physical, spiritual, and emotional needs of congregants, and conducting important life events such as weddings and funerals. But I think the baseline tests, the stress tests, are very similar. Are we behaving in ways that are responsible, responsive, and resilient? As a religious individual, the question I ask myself is my faith helping me constructively and appropriately respond during this crisis? As a Christian, I ask myself, am I doing a better or worse job in living the two great commandments? Let me conclude by saying just a word about the legal frameworks we have for addressing the issues. In a time of crisis, it's really easy to think that everything we're experiencing is so unique, so unusual, and so different that we forget that we have really powerful, effective, and well-established mechanisms for analyzing limitations on religious freedom. The basic principle is non-discrimination. So we can ask ourselves, are the regulations, the rules, the limitations neutral in general? Are they being applied and promulgated in ways that are even-handed? We also have very powerful legal doctrines for assessing limitations on religious freedom. In the United States, we're all familiar with the compelling state interest test. And it seems to me to be extremely useful in thinking about the situation we're in. Obviously, the health and safety needs create compelling state interest and justify various types of limitations. But the second part of that test asks us to focus on the question of whether there is a less restrictive means of accomplishing the compelling state interest. And it seems to me that this is a useful question for all of us to be asking in our various institutional capacities. Are we adopting measures that are as respectful of freedom as possible in light of the very extraordinary and unusual circumstances we find ourselves? There's a counterpart of this in the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. We call this the necessity test. There are basically three requirements here. The first is rule of law. Are the various enactments properly enacted by appropriate authority? Are the uses of emergency powers no greater than is necessary under the circumstances? Second, is there a legitimate ground for the limitation? The answer here will obviously often be yes. Public health, public safety, public order, and the rights and freedoms of others all bear upon the legitimacy of limitations upon our freedom at this time. But the third element of the test is, of course, the most important one, and it is whether the limitation is genuinely necessary, or as the European Court often phrases it, necessary in a democratic society. Here we focus on things such as the nature of the social need and whether the measures adopted are proportionate to the legitimate aim pursued. Obviously, the rules ought to be neutral and impartial rather than arbitrary, and there needs to be a rational connection between the measures contemplated and the social goods being pursued. So, in conclusion, I'd invite all of us to think about this crisis as providing a stress test for us in our individual lives and in our institutional roles. Are we behaving in ways that are responsible, that are responsive, and that exhibit resilience? And are we utilizing existing frameworks in ways that are responsive, imaginative, and appropriate for the situations in which we find ourselves. And finally, to echo something that Francesco said, and that will be the topic of our webinar next week, are there concepts such as the idea of human dignity for all people at all times and all places that can help us as we navigate and chart these difficult waters? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett, also for being on time and for raising a very important point, which actually have generated quite a few questions that we will address after the last intervention. We will try to address most of them. I don't know if we'll be able to address all of them, but we will try also to answer by writing down to the question that you have raised. I have already done so to some of the questions, and I invite the co-hosts to do the same for the questions directly addressed to them. So our last speaker is Professor Marco Ventura, which is Professor of Religion at the University of Siena and the Director of the Center for Religious Studies at the Bruno Kessler Foundation in Trento. Professor Ventura, you have the floor.
Thank you, Pasquale. Thank you, Francesco. And I would also start with greeting and thanking the partners to this initiative. I would like to offer a couple of thoughts about how I see in these initial remarks our initiative as being hopefully meaningful, and which correspond also to my main concerns about experts on religion and religious people and the civil society interacting with religion might work together in this present crisis. One aspect which I'd like to focus on is what I resent as a need to understand, and this would be probably the more academic side, corresponding also to probably the academic side in the audience today. I saw that there's quite a good deal of colleagues in the group, but at the same time we also have, fortunately, it's quite a good balance in fact, people who do not belong to the academia. Of course they will need to be a part in the effort of understanding, as they invite us also on the other side to focus on another need, complementary need, which I see as a need to act. So need to understand, need to act will be briefly the two sides of the thoughts I'd like to share. Now, in terms of understanding, my reflection is as follows: that I think what we observe is quite a prompt response by religious actors in terms, as have been said, in terms of mobilizing to face the crisis in humanitarian terms, generally speaking. Well, now, I see this as clearly corresponding to a pattern which has been emerging recently, I would say beyond the pandemic, which is a pattern of mobilization of religious actors for sustainable development in the horizon of the SDGs. Well, I think that what you observe now is a pattern which has been existed for quite some time in contemporary terms, and which is now going to be amplified. And this is quite a clear picture in my eyes. I don't know what you think, but this is quite clear in my eyes. My point is that while this is very true, we risk forgetting about a very important aspect of the understanding, of the effort in understanding what's going on, which is the internal struggle and tensions and contradictions and dynamics of religious people and religious communities, which of course means also religion in society. So it's indissociable from the struggle in society. Now, my reflection in terms of what I define as the need to understand gets precisely there. While we observe the pattern of religions for sustainable development, we should also be able to look at what is happening in this dynamic of religious change. And Brett mentioned before the article published by The Economist in the last issue, And the title is very telling in this regard. The title is, I'm sharing it through the chat, "The Pandemic Has Exposed Fissures Within Religions." Now, I don't know if this is correct or not. I frankly find this quite accurate, but this is a way for me to point in this direction. Let's look at what is happening in terms of change within religious actors. Someone in the questions asked, for instance, a question about the possible fragmentation. I think the name was Erika. Erika asked about the fragmentation of religious authority, for instance. That would be something. Theological developments is another dimension. Now, moving to the need to act. Here again, I observe a pattern which is sort of more consolidated pattern in my eyes, which is again a pattern of mobilization very strongly within nations, I would say, but that's the religious communities mobilizing around the people, around the nation, building, a common response, building a solidarity, building unity. Again, this is very clear and very important, and I think that when we think of how to act, of course, there's a call, there's a need for calling for all religious people, religious actors, to be a part of this unity, a part of this common effort. Now, here again, I also see another part, which is hidden or problematic, and where we really need a conversation about how to mobilize and how to act. And that part is, well, fine, for all the unity, for all the common effort, for all the solidarity, we still have differences, we still have diversity, and we welcome religion as a voice of diversity, as a force of diversity. As we are faced with totalitarian risk and totalitarian pushes, I think that the difference of religious voices might also be more precisely articulated as critical voices. And there the question would be, in my eyes, where we would draw the line, where would we set limit in terms of the need we have for religions to be critical voices, and for religions to constantly remind society about the need for plurality, for contextual pluralism. I thank Wahida here in her question, and I close my intervention, for bringing gender into to our attention. I think that gender equality and LGBTQI rights, for instance, as far as they balancing with FoRB is concerned, will be a great test, as probably environmental rights will be as well. I will stop here with my need for understanding and my need for acting points. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Ventura and to all the panelists. I want to say to all the attendees that we are seeing their questions, we are trying to address them. I take the opportunity and abuse of my role of moderator to say hi to Miriam Hunter and in from London, which I see she raised her hand and maybe she wants to ask a question. And I think that then Francesco will have floor for this. And actually I leave the floor now to Francesco because I think he has some polls and some other things that he wants to share with you. Francesco.
Thank you, Pasquale. Well, the poll that I wanted to share is towards the end, actually, just to get a sense of what the interest from this group is for future webinars. But let me launch it right now, and so that you have time to gather the results. So you should see it in a few minutes. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list, so please keep suggesting, keep sending in your suggestions, and we're still considering many of the topics and the compositions of the future panels. So any suggestions and contributions are greatly appreciated.
In the meantime, Francesco, if I can, while you launch, I have a question for Brett, which was raised by Xenia Eggert. So Brett, if you are ready to answer that question, I will read that out to you. So, could we expect as one of the consequences of this pandemic, in which the states were the main actors dealing with the virus, that states would boost their pressure to restrict the forum external of religious believers even after the pandemic ends?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's one I've been thinking a lot about as well recently. What I think we need to do is adopt sort of a three-part perspective when we're thinking about situations like this. Before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis. I've written about this in other contexts involving hate speech. The basic idea is before the crisis occurs, there's various types of planning and preparation, relationship building, institution building that is very, very helpful. And so in the case of responding to hate speech, for example, having religious leaders get to know each other and have relationships of trust so that when the dark night comes of the crisis, say a terrible act of hate speech or even violence in the name of religion, there is the ability to respond in ways that are productive and helpful. There's not a lot of time for thinking and contemplation in the midst of the crisis and in the moment of response. And one predictable tendency is the overreaction. We might overreact to hate speech by enacting very sweeping legal limitations. And so the aftermath is a time for reflection and assessment. And it's also a time where it's really important to revisit the questions of necessity, of whether there is a less restrictive means of accomplishing the state's interest in protecting health and safety. And so I think this is something we're going to have to be very mindful of as we emerge from this crisis, that where measures have been necessary, but they may not be necessary indefinitely, that we find appropriate ways to lessen and eliminate those limitations to the extent possible. Again, I think the legal frameworks we have are quite robust. And so, for example, if we simply focus on the question of necessity and proportionality, the answers to the questions with respect to particular limitations is going to change over time. And so as we emerge from the crisis, as therapeutic responses are found, as eventually a inoculation of some sort is found, we want to be able to return to the baseline of freedom as quickly and as completely as possible.
Thank you very much, Brett, for stressing this, I think, a crucial point, not only as far as freedom of religion is concerned, but many of other civil rights. I mean, in some countries, as in our case, we are also barred to go outside from home, which is also another infringement of civil rights as well. So I hope that the balance is and can be found soon. I see that Miriam has now typed in her question, so I can read it out. So my question to all, so anybody of the panelists can intervene, was whether we had an idea of the impact of the online alternatives and virtual community on older worshippers. Second question was whether religious communities could now see more recognition of their democratic role, their importance in building a common vivre ensemble beyond their own religious community. So all the panelists that was to intervene, maybe the first is probably more addressed to the kind of intervention that Jad made in the beginning, and then of course the others, feel free to jump on it. What I ask to you is just to go straight to the point, very sharp answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Pasquale. I can take an initial crack at responding to the one about, it was older worshipers, elderly worshipers, is that right?
Yeah, correct.
Just I think yesterday on our website, religionanddiplomacy.org.uk, we published an essay entitled, "Will COVID-19 Lead to a Religious Recession?" By a scholar who looks at the economics of religion. And he seemed to indicate that, yes, there will be a discernible decrease in religiosity, particularly among Christians in the United States, if this continues on for several more weeks or even months, particularly among more elderly worshipers. A lot of congregations are largely elderly, and it's the elderly who are least likely to have high-speed broadband internet, are, by stereotype, the least likely to be able to be savvy in how they use technology, and the most vulnerable when it comes to the coronavirus. So they're the most likely to stay self-isolating, the least likely to be able to access or to want to access online services. They tend to also be those who are the most generous tithers to churches, which would hurt the bottom line of a number of congregations. So I think that's particularly where a number of Christian congregations will feel a particular pinch in the weeks and months and even years to come as a result of this possible religious recession from the pandemic.
Thank you, Brett. One attendee is asking if you can share the link to the article in the chat with all the attendees, because there is interest in reading it. So if you can do that in the meantime. If the other panelists want to address the issue of the democratic role of religious communities, I don't know if Professor Ventura or Francesco have something to say about that.
Well, that's very relevant, as I mentioned before. The point is that the pressure is very much today on the coming together. So, of course, the coming together in a democratic society would be about coming together democratically. But we also have, even in what are usually stereotyped as the most democratic society, a lot of troubles about what democracy means. So I would tend to think of religion as a part of this conversation. As some of our attendees underlined, this also needs to be very contextual. This really needs, the caveat here is never enough. We need to be very aware that contexts are very different. I come from a country, Italy, which is extremely diverse within. We all know for our countries how variations can be strong even within the same country. And the issue of the participation of religion in the democratic life, in the crisis, needs to be assessed against this contextual element. And another point is that I see, my suggestion would be to look at the issue of religions and democracy in the present dispensation, along with the issue of religion in development and religion in the economy, since the recovery in the economy or whatever will come in the recession, after the recession, will have an impact on democracy and vice versa. So I really think of religion and democracy and religion and development, in particular in the economy, as probably the two faces of the same coin and the same question.
Thank you. I want to give the floor to Francesco, because then we have also another, I think, very relevant question from a legal point of view, which I want to present to you. Francesco.
Thank you. Thank you, Pasquale. I'll be very short. Looking at the roles that religions and churches can have in the democracy to the benefit of the common good, I'm looking at what, for example, the contribution could be at the community level, the social level, at the welfare level, as mentioned by Marco. The community level, the roles that the churches have throughout their congregations is very important. When the pandemic will be over, these congregations and these communities can start from some foundations that they had built before. They don't have to start from scratch. From from the welfare point of view, many churches and organizations are built in a way that they can consider and provide some sort of support, whether financial or by way of providing goods or food or anything type of support to not only to the members of their congregations, but also to the community at large. This is something that we as a church do have as programs, not only directed towards our own members, but also to the community. And these are aspects, as Professor Ventura mentioned, employment, the economic crisis that is already unfolding and will probably hit our countries. Churches will have a role to play. And in terms of social and support to the democratic process, I think it's important, as I mentioned, that the roles of religious leaders, the roles that the religious leaders have in promoting a peaceful approach, an optimistic view and outlook to these crises, rather than fomenting fear or negative looks. They have the opportunity to actually help their congregations and their communities to look to the future with more optimism.
Thank you, Francesco. I think that we have got a question which is key in all the kind of approach that states are having on COVID, but also, of course, from religious groups. So the questions come from Ari De Pater. And the question is this: in preparing for a return to normal, various governments are considering apps monitoring people. Oh, that's gone down. This could easily be linked to religious affiliation or the person monitored. Are there examples, e.g. from China, where this has been the case, either publicly or secretly? So the issue is basically privacy and data protection and surveillance of religious groups. Is this going to be a new normal then, after this?
Maybe I can take a preliminary crack at that, Pasquale. I want to first briefly say something about the question about older worshipers. I think this raises a really important issue because on the one hand, the coronavirus does not discriminate. It operates on laws that are not socially constructed, but it's very clear that the vulnerabilities vary significantly from group to group, and the consequences are quite different for different groups. One thing that we're becoming aware of in the United States is that blue-collar workers are more susceptible than are white-collar workers. The nature of their work keeps them out providing services. It's a luxury for those of us who can self-isolate and work from home and participate in a webinar. We see differences based upon economics, based upon race, based upon age, based upon gender. It really is just such a remarkable challenge that we're facing, because on the one hand, it treats us all the same, but on the other hand, the effects that it has on us are very different. We know that elderly people are much more likely to die from this. And from the perspective of religious communities, we know that people who are less familiar, less comfortable with technology might find it more difficult to feel connected at a time of physical distancing. I appreciated the comment that came in from World Vision that we prefer the nomenclature physical distancing rather than social distancing. What we really need is physical distance and social proximity, social outreach, social support as much as possible. And I think each of us needs to be very aware of the most vulnerable in the communities to which we belong, including the religious communities, and how this pandemic might really have different magnitudes of effect on different groups of people. And so the homeless, for example, are going to be affected in ways that are very different than those who have homes that we live in. with respect to the question about monitoring and the return to normal, I think this is going to be a very important question in the months and years ahead. I think that it's quite easy for us to get comfortable with levels of intrusion and oversight at times of emergency. And if that gets reset as a so-called new normal, that might be very detrimental to our civil liberties in the long run. What we ought to be willing to put up with, endure, cooperate with during times of genuine emergency is very different than what we ought to be expected to endure and cooperate with during more ordinary times. What I would encourage us to do is to really use the legal frameworks we have. Is there a compelling state interest? Is there a less restrictive means? Is this limitation genuinely necessary? Does it remain necessary? Is it proportionate? And I think if we focus on these existing tools, we have a toolbox which can really help us navigate the difficult situation we're in.
Thank you very much, Judd. Now it's 4:01, so we are there. I thank all the attendees for raising a very relevant question, and we will consider all of them, even those of them who have been unable to answer, as a feedback for future webinars. So the organizing committee will reconvene to plan, and we will consider all the feedback that you have put it there, because it's highly relevant comments. Francesco, I want to give you the floor to conclude the webinar if you have any final announcement, and then we can give the details for the next webinars as well.
Thank you very much, Pasquale, and thank you to the speakers, and thank you to all those who have attended. I'm sharing now the results of the poll that shows your interest, where it lies, and we'll, as mentioned by Pasquale, we'll look into all of the all of our planning to see to try and fit as much as we can in an orderly and a productive way. Just a way as announcement, as Pasquale mentioned, we will send soon the invitation for our next webinar next week. Our webinars will be always on Thursdays at 3 p.m. Central European Time, and we look forward to have you. Next week, again, we will have Dr. Birdsall as moderator of a panel with Professor Scharfs and Professor Ventura, together with Dr. Jan Fiegel, the former Special Envoy on the promotion of freedom of religious belief outside the European Union. And it's going to be a very interesting panel discussing COVID-19 and its impact on human dignity. Once again, thank you very much for joining. Please send us questions if you have. We'll try to address those that have been shared. We wish you a wonderful week.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you to all of you.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.